East Boston was 5 separate islands, which is hard to believe today because there's been so much filling to connect them. The largest was called Noddle's Island.
The first Europeans arriving in East Boston were met by the Massachusetts, one of the many Algonquin tribes. Noddle's Island was primarily used as pasture land. In the early part of the 19th century, William Hislop Sumner attracted many new businesses that would actually develop the commercial waterfront with streets laid out on a grid. Boston's maritime economy was one of the major features of the 18th and early 19th century. And in many ways, maritime economy was building clipper ships. Life on the docks was something that was thrilling, it was titillating, there was constant frenetic motion. By the period of the 1850s, Donald Mackay's clipper ships had become so large that they actually traversed the globe. When a ship arrived, or a ship was even launched, it was something that brought everyone to the waterfront. And it began to show the evolution of East Boston in that period from what was Bostonians to the beginnings of immigrants, many of which came to actually seek employment. The Irish were the first. In the 1840s, because of a potato famine, many people began to seek immigration, which would actually allow them to come to the New World.
Immigrants from Europe primarily would come here to East Boston. The Russian Jews were peasants. They were all very poor when they came over, only allowed to bring at the most of any value 2 watches, for example, per family.
My grandmother was actually smuggled out of Sicily into Italy. She had to get married on the boat. Women could not step foot off the boat unless they were married. You had to have a father or a relative waiting for you. So the priests from the North End or the rabbis or the ministers would board ships and marry people so they could get off the boat, marry the women.
I came from Colombia. I'm living in East Boston for 24 years already. It's a lot of good changes that we can speak freely Spanish. We can find the streets better, more clean.
My one hope for East Boston would be that the middle class stays, mostly the Latino population. I also find it funny because not long ago, the Irish moved out, then the Italians came in, then the Italians moved out, and now we're moving out, and someone else is going to come in. I feel like East Boston's always constantly changing, but I hope at least a little bit of that culture stays behind so it stays diverse.
As an immigrant, I think you sort of tend to stay where there's access to the work. My father worked on the waterfront, as did all of his brothers. And when I look back on it, I'm like, wow, this was like a storybook for a kid because there was so many sounds and so many smells and so much activity that constituted a day in the life of. I mean, you were either smelling the ocean air, you were smelling the steam that was coming out of the trains as they chugged along. You could hear the seagulls, and sometimes you could even hear the guys while they were offloading or unloading cargo onto the ship.
East Boston became a conduit for transportation, whether it was ferries, the narrow gauge railroad, or the East Boston Airport.
Since East Boston was located on an island across the harbor from the main part of Boston, it was served from the very beginning by ferries.
We would hop trolleys from that ferry and go all the way to Winthrop, would go to Revere Beach. You heard that clanging, and I can hear it now in my head and heart. In 1952, in December, was the last ferry. We took that ferry, we cried.
The East Boston Airport would open in 1927. It was basically one landing strip and one small wooden building. But by the 1930s, the East Boston Airport was actually growing by leaps and bounds. As a place in some ways that not just did people live here, but it was a means of accessing the world.
1978, this was a private shipyard here at Jeffreys Point. A few ships being repaired, and the immigration docks had been abandoned for at least half a century by then and looked at. And again, we're falling in.
We used to try to jump off from the pier into the water. But at any point, you know, you could see a car that was just dropped into the harbor. The harbor was pretty polluted.
So the building is about 100 years old. So the original structure was part of Bethlehem Steel. When we first saw the building was empty, it was derelict. The roof was partially missing, it was filled with pigeons. It was in pretty rough shape. I think it was condemned, actually. Yet there was some very interesting architectural features that were there when we first looked at it, like the gantry cranes and the rolling trucks and the partial train track still intact. So those became, in a way, artifacts that we wanted to hold on to. They give a sense of time, a sense of place.
Climate Ready Boston is a huge vulnerability assessment for the entire city of Boston. Our vision to create a resilient Boston Harbor, it's not just to protect and fortify the shoreline, but also to embrace the shoreline. A lot of parts of East Boston are filled lands, and so they're at lower elevation and most at risk to sea level rise. So overall, for the city of Boston, we predict there to be about 36 inches of sea level rise by 2070. And so that's what we're trying to protect. We're trying to use different strategies and solutions to build along the shoreline. The strategies that we're focusing on for the city is using nature-based shoreline solutions. So say marshes, living shorelines, vegetated berms, so like little hills right on the edge of the water so that the water can't go over.
To have access now to the water and get closer to the skyline, it's a totally different experience. You know, I think there are a lot of exciting things happening here in East Boston. East Boston has always been a tight-knit community made up of working immigrants, families who are trying to get by, kids who enjoy playing in the streets.
I think that sooner or later there'll sort of be a new profile in the community, but I hope it never loses the sense of connectedness and caring that has always been characteristic of East Boston.